Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is Artistic Photography, How to Take Wow-Worthy Wildlife Photos with NatHab Expedition Leader and Professional Photographer Danielle Carstens. Thank you so much for being here today, Danielle. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Brooke. I really appreciate that beautiful intro of yours. Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to hear there's quite a few, hopefully, photographers listening today and tuning in. As Brooke was saying, we'll be talking about artistic wildlife photography that's a little bit different. This is my first webinar for NatHab, so I hope there's a few more to come. Brooke and I were just talking before the webinar, saying that hopefully there's a few more photographic presentations to come in the following months. So let's get right into it. Just to give you a brief introduction of who I am Danielle Carstens. I'm a born and bred South African. I'm a professional wildlife photographer and instructor, and I joined NatHab in 2023, and I lead the South African expeditions for NatHab. Hold a BSc in physical therapy, and then I changed careers at the age of 30. I did a professional photography certificate through the New York Institute of Photography, and I've been full-time photo guiding in Southern Africa since 2019. For the past 5 years, I lived in Botswana, where I lived and worked in Botswana, and I came back home to South Africa last year. Other projects that I'm involved in, I'm part of Girls Who Click, which is a mentorship program for younger female wildlife photographers in what has been a predominantly male field. So I mentor younger female wildlife photographers in the industry, and I'm also very passionate about canine anti-poaching units. I've been involved in a project for canine anti-poaching, and I believe in the power that dogs have in conservation. Otherwise, in my free time, I love swimming, water sports, dogs, and I'm the happiest when I'm out in the wild in Africa, camping away from the crowds. So that's me in a nutshell. That's me growing up in the bush. So this is where my love for wildlife and conservation started from a very young age in a Big Five reserve. That's the vehicle that I learned to drive on the left. It's a stick shift, but you need a hammer pretty much to change the gear. First pair of binoculars, which are now accompanied by a proper camera. And then walking in the bush has always been a love of mine. And I think it's these years of my life that shaped my philosophy on conservation. I have always seen myself as a visitor in the wildlife's world, in their arena, and not. I haven't. I still struggle with the idea of the bush being a business, and that's the philosophy of us being visitors in their area is what I try and instill in my guests, and that's the basis of my guiding philosophy. Right, so in the presentation today, we'll briefly be talking about taking control of light, which is photography, unique imagery, and then the main focus will be on creative techniques, creating images that, as I said, stand out from the crowd, that wow the viewer, not just any ordinary image. Anyone can take an ordinary image, but we want to go a little bit further and get creative and artistic, maybe even sell a print or two, which we'll talk about. Then, so basically, I'll talk about light conditions necessary for those creative techniques, camera settings, and editing. Those are the three main categories that I'll be talking about. So you might have seen images such as these on a wall, maybe in a lodge, or on someone's dining room wall at home. And hopefully, as a photographer, these images speak to you more than just an ordinary image. It evokes something in you that says, hey, this is a little bit different. This is not just a hippo, or this is not just an elephant, for example. It has a creative and an artistic element to it. Sometimes even common species. I mean, this is a very common species, but bathed in beautiful light and photographed in an artistic way, and suddenly it goes from ordinary to extraordinary. So it's not about the species always in photography. It's often just about special light and how to work with it. Photography is drawing with light. That is the official definition of the word photography. And drawing with light means that us as photographers can take control of light. And that's the beauty of it. That's where the art comes in. So taking control of light is the most precious skill that you can develop as a photographer. And it gets you beautiful images. Right. So creative techniques, there's a few. There's many, but there's a few that I use mainly in my wildlife photography, and these are the techniques. So initially, I thought I was going to talk about all of them because these are the ones that I use. But after I got past low key, I realized that my presentation was long enough and that the others are going to have to wait for another presentation. So I will be focusing on high key and low key photography. Don't worry too much if you don't know what that is yet. I'll be explaining these in detail. Under low key, I classify front light, side light, and rim light as forms of low key photography. Let's start with high key. High key photography, the official definition is it refers to bright images with very few shadows that are characterized by light and cheerful feel. So it's bright, light, happy images that are predominantly lighter in tone, so whites or pale tones. Very importantly, the detail remains in the subject, while the surrounding detail in the background or the foreground is mostly lost. That's very important, and I'll demonstrate that now. So there's a high-key photograph of a Nile crocodile. Beautiful detail remains in the subject, but the surroundings, background, foreground, everywhere is a whiteout, is a white canvas. And this is mostly done in camera. Then there's an elephant that's busy shaking off the dust off of what he's about to eat. And you can see there's beautiful texture in the trunk. It's not a silhouette as it would normally be. If you just took the photo normally, it would be a silhouette against the bright background. But now there's detail and texture showing up with a whiteout background. Same with the giraffe. Love giraffes for high key photography. They work extremely well. So do zebras, leopards, cheetahs, anything that's spotted or two-toned works really well for high key. But giraffes, I'd struggle to resist a high key photograph of a giraffe against the sky, and that's mainly where their heads usually are, is against the sky. So the light conditions that are necessary for, or required, I should say, for high key, it's very important to know that not every photograph is a high key photo opportunity. And this is super important. You cannot turn any photo opportunity into a high key. And I've seen some photographers masking the background and then white out, they do a complete whiteout on the background and the subject remains, and then they have to tweak the subject too, and it just looks unprofessional and it looks a little bit artificial if you don't have the correct lighting conditions from the start. And that's why your subject has to be darker than its surroundings, or it has to be shadowed. As long as the tones on the subject are darker than what it's surrounded by, or the background, I use those interchangeably, surroundings and background, but you know what I mean, the white part on the photograph. Subject has to be darker than the background, and the background has to be light, especially lighter than the subject, and it has to be fairly clean. No distractions in the background, preferably, because that distracts from your subject. And then contrast is key, and I put this in orange because that is so important, and you'll hear me talking about it throughout the presentation. Contrast here is absolutely key to getting a successful, professional looking high key photograph. Solid lighting, very important. No dappled light, because we're working with brighter images on towards the overexposed side. If there are any hot spots on the animal, on the subject, they'll blow out, they'll be too bright, and they'll be very distracting. So solid, continuous lighting of like either full shadow on the subject and preferably full light on the background. That's very important. Again, contrast. Overcast conditions work really well for this because there's a massive diffuser in the sky, which is the cloud cover, and it's less directional. So you don't get a beak shadow across the bird's chest, and you don't get an ear shadow across the wildebeest's face. It leads to, as we like, as photographers, we like diffused light that's non-directional. So the same applies for high key photography. Backlighting does help, even if it is in overcast conditions, because then the shadow is on your side. So there'll be even more contrast between subject lighting and background. You'll be shooting into a bright background, but you'll be on the shaded side of the subject. And then be very careful when subject contains borderless white. So when your subject, for example, look at this pygmy goose on the left here, you'll see there is almost no border. So the facial whites blend and merge into the background. So just be careful of that. You might have to brush back the highlights slightly on the subject. It also happens a lot on giraffes. So if the giraffe is very light and if you've had to overexpose a lot, this part here where my mouse is, there will be completely white out, for example, and it'll just look like a chunk is missing from the giraffe's face. So be very careful of borderless whites. If there's too many, it looks a little bit odd. Camera settings. As for mode, shutter priority, aperture priority, manual, any mode in which you can apply exposure compensation. This is so important for high key and low key photography. Any mode, you can be on manual, shutter priority, aperture priority. But as long as you can manually control, or you take control of the exposure, not leave it up to the camera. That's the important part. Exposing for the subject, because there's a very bright background and a dark subject, the camera cannot see detail or show up detail in both. So you have to choose. The camera doesn't have the ability to show you detail in the bright water and in the dark subject. So you have to choose, and that's what we mean by expose for the subject. Prioritize the subject's lighting. Here comes the important part. Overexpose in camera. I start usually with 2 stops of light in camera because I'm a little bit wary of clipping the highlights on the subject. So I don't go to +3 from the start. It depends. Play around with your camera and different situations will differ, but start with +2. Note the clipped highlights. I check my blinkies or my highlight alerts. I have them on playback, and I make sure that the whites don't blow out, meaning it's going to blink at you in camera. It's going to tell you I've lost all detail in the subject whites. You have to go down on your exposure. Those highlights and whites, those whites that you've lost are not recoverable afterwards, meaning you cannot bring back detail in them later on should you wish to paint them back. So make sure that they don't completely blow out and be too bright in camera. Now with the overexposure, I am in manual mode and my ISO is on auto. So when I go +2 or I add stops of light, the camera uses the ISO to do so. This is different if you use spot metering. I use evaluative metering. It's also called matrix or ESP or multi, depending on the brand that you use. I use evaluative metering plus my exposure compensation shortcut. If you use spot metering, you won't be using as much exposure compensation, but you'll have to be really good at spot metering on the dark part of the subject. I don't like spot metering for wildlife. It's a personal preference. That's a whole different webinar on its own, but I prefer to be on evaluative metering. If you do choose to be on full manual, then you'll need to use your overexposure. You'll need to manually apply over and underexposure with these techniques using your shutter, your aperture, or your ISO. So you'll have to do it manually, whereas I use a shortcut. All right. Camera settings, ISO, as low as possible. But why? If we have such a bright image, doesn't make sense, right? Because high ISO will produce noise, and noise hides in the shadows or the darker tones. And in this case, that is your subject, unfortunately. On a high ISO, there'll be no noise shown in the light parts, or very minimal noise, grain shown up in the light parts. But there will be noise showing up in the darker parts, and that's your subject, unfortunately. So with high key, very important to take note of keeping your ISO as low as possible. Therefore, your aperture is wide open to keep the ISO down, and watch your shutter speed. Your shutter speed has to be on the lower side For stationary subjects, that's not so important. But generally, once I overexpose, I go +2 in camera, I automatically drop my shutter speed because I know that otherwise my ISO is going to go high and it's going to ruin my subject. It's going to ruin the quality. As for focus, your focus tracking might struggle here because you are photographing into a bright area. So sometimes with some cameras, they struggle a little bit with that. In that case, don't use your tracking. Just go to a single point or a cluster of focus points, and that should do the trick if it really doesn't work manual focus. But a single or cluster focus points should be fine. I just find that tracking is not as reliable with bright shooting into bright light. The background whites will clip. I often see my guests looking at their photographs that they took with high key in mind, and the background's flashing at them. Their blinkies are flashing, and they're worried about it. And I say it's not to worry, as long as your subject doesn't blink. As long as the highlights and the whites on your subject look fine, that's okay. The sky or the water, whatever light background is behind the subject, will definitely clip. What we mean by clip is it's too bright. It's lost detail and it's irrecoverable. Subject whites preferably not clipping, as I mentioned. So for example, that is in camera with a little bit of editing afterwards, but really 90% in camera. Going from what the camera would give you if you did not overexpose. I'm in evaluative metering, remember. If I added 2 stops of light, which I did in camera, this is the result. So that's the difference that it makes. In this case, I added 2 2/3 stops of light to this image. Dark subject, light background, and conversion to black and white. And it came out as a beautiful black and white high key. High key does lend itself to black and white. Color is fine. Color is also good. For example, this one should not be in black and white. But black and white works really well for high key, especially because you often end up with a washed out image and you can bring back more contrast with black and white. It's a little bit more forgiving. Same there. Again, a fairly ordinary common species, but portrayed in an artistic way purely by adding 2 1/3 stops of light to the image. Then we get to the editing. As it was with the photographing and the settings, your subject is priority here. Same thing as when you were taking the photograph. Convert it to black and white if that's what you want. As I mentioned, you don't always have to do a high key in black and white, but it does look amazing. Not for colorful subjects, but the rest look great in black and white. Contrast was the goal when you were photographing, and it remains a goal when you're editing. Remain or keep the contrast in your editing process. Texture in the background is up to you. I don't like to put the subjects on a floating in the middle of nowhere on a white canvas. I like some context. For example, the ripples here on the water around the pygmy goose gives it context, shows you where it is. But it's completely up to you. Some people like a complete whiteout background. Some people like a more textured background. Completely your choice. Then watch the subject whites, as I said. When you edit, watch your histogram so that it doesn't clip. I'll show you now in an editing insert. And then masking I do after I've edited everything in the scene. So I'll edit the whole photograph. I'll take you through what I do mostly now, soon. But after you've done the whole photograph, then mask the subject and then you continue your editing on the subject only. So for global editing, meaning the whole photograph, global sliders and everything, I'll do noise reduction if necessary. And then I will do sharpening. You'll see on my clip insert. Then I'll convert it to black and white if that's what I want. And then I will increase the global exposure until the background is a white canvas or as light as I want it. The subject will wash out, but you can bring that back. That's what I do generally. This is not a recipe at all. This is a guideline for you to try. There's so many ways of doing things in Lightroom. I just find that this is the process that I mostly use, but different subjects, different lighting conditions, different preferences. It's just a guideline for you. If the whites start clipping when you global overexpose, it's okay. As I said, you can fix that later. As long as they're not clipping, as long as they're not too bright when you are photographing, When they go too white in the editing, it's okay. You can bring them down again. That's it for global. Then local, I'll mask the subject. I think that's the best way to do it, in my opinion. Now that the masking feature in Lightroom is so advanced, it makes life a lot easier. Just make sure that your mask is well defined. Then black and whites to clipping points. So I'll watch my histogram while I adjust the blacks and the whites. I'll bring back the shadows and the blacks in the subject because they do wash out because you are overexposing. I would brush down localized highlights, as I said, if they start becoming too bright with the overexposure. Texture and clarity, a little bit, don't overdo it, more so in black and white images. And then saturation for color images. And if it's necessary, at the end, dehaze and contrast if your editing process hasn't added enough contrast already. Now, recently, my Lightroom has been freezing and giving me trouble. And I figured that with Murphy's Law, it's going to do it while I'm in a presentation. So as much as I wanted to share screen and go into Lightroom now, I did a recording earlier just to make the editing insert and clip stress-free for everyone. If it starts buffering on your side, then Brooke is going to just play it from her side. So let's see how it goes. It's 2 images that I edited, and I'll talk you through my process here. Let's have a look.
Let's have a look at this image here as an example. To look at the settings quickly, you'll see I was at 320 ISO and my shutter speed was at 1000. And that's what I mean by keep your shutter speed fairly low. Because I knew that I was going to overexpose and my ISO was going to go high. It didn't go too high, but I probably could have overexposed a little bit more in camera here. It was probably a quick decision to try a high key and then go back to something different. But because of the 320 ISO, I'm not going to apply noise reduction to this image. It's not necessary. So I would start with sharpening, and I do a selective mask to just sharpen the edges. I'm holding Option down on my Mac. Then sharpen just that area to about the middle of the slider. I do want to convert this image to black and white. So that's where to do it. I do sometimes use the profiles that Lightroom gives me, but in this case, I like to take full control of the editing. So I won't do the profiles for now. I would start straight off with the global exposure and I would increase it until I'm happy with the background. So disregard the subject for now. Just look at the background. As I said, I don't like it floating in the middle of nowhere with a complete whiteout around. Not always, especially in this case because the elephants' heads are just floating in the middle of nowhere. So I'm pretty happy with, I'll probably say there as a background. I would obviously crop beforehand, but I'm just focusing on the slider edits for now. So just looking at the background, I'm pretty happy. Some texture here in the water so you can see the elephants in their environment where they are. Then I would go into selective editing. So local editing, I would mask subject. Lightroom does a pretty good job of that. And then I would start with black and white clips. I would keep this indicator on there in the corner. If it has a little white block around it, means you can see when it's clipping. So if I take the whites up, Lightroom will show me where in the red areas where the whites are clipping. And remember, this is just on the subject now. This is on this subject mask. So I'm taking the whites up until I see that they're not clipping. The water is clipping a little bit there, so maybe I'll go down just slightly. A little bit of clipping is really not the end of the world. It's completely up to you whether you like the look of it and whether you can see details. And obviously if you're editing for print versus just for social media or other goals. Then the blacks, same thing, would go down. This is very subjective. I mean, if you don't have to take it to the clipping point, because to me the elephants look a little bit too dark there. So I'd probably take it there. And then the next thing is I would bring back the shadows. I'm still on the subject masks and I'm increasing the shadows there. So just to bring out just to bring out what the details in the subject should be, because you should see, remember, you should see details in the subject. Now you can use the general slider to take down highlights in the mask, in the subject, as you can see. But what I like to do is I like to use a brush for the highlights that to me are too bright. So I would go down on highlights, and it looks a little bit odd because of my pointer being exaggerated. It looks a bit odd on my screen, and I'm screen recording, but there, just to show you, I'll be painting down the glaring highlights in these areas. My auto mask is on, and then probably a little bit in these areas as well. I'm just demonstrating now, but you can spend a lot of time on your own photos doing the same thing. All right, pretty happy with that now. And then still on the subject mask, I would add some texture and some clarity. You can be quite generous with texture and clarity, especially in black and white images. It looks incredible. Now I'd look at the overall image, and I'm pretty happy with it. You can, if you're not happy with how bright that water is, you can still take that down with a brush. If it's necessary to dehaze and to add contrast, you can. In this case, I'm pretty happy with the contrast as is. And looking at it overall, I might just add a little bit of a global exposure again. There you go, slightly lift out the elephants there. It's completely up to you how much you want the subject to wash out or not. I like a textured dark subject on a white background. And that's the end product, and you can see compared to where we started, it makes for a beautiful artistic looking photograph. Let's have a look at a color image quickly. So I'll go through the edits that I've already done on the black and white fairly quickly, but just to show you the difference with a color image, because turning this lilac-breasted roller into black and white would really not do justice to the beautiful colors on it. Now, as you can see, I was at ISO 1000, which is high, fairly high. My shutter was quite low, and because I went +2, that's why I pushed the ISO. That's why I'm saying watch your shutter, lower shutters generally, low as possible ISO, and then expose in camera already +2. If I hadn't exposed +2 in camera, this is what it would have looked like somewhere there in camera. And that's why it's important to expose in camera. That's a whole different topic by itself, whether you should do it in camera or afterwards, but I prefer to do it in camera. Now, I would do noise reduction on this image just because of the ISO, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to do it now. I'll start with the sharpening, selective mask for sharpening, as I did before. Now, with this image, I can do everything globally. I don't have to mask the subject because there's not much in the background that's going to change except for the subject when I apply a change, but I'm a creature of habit, and that's what I do. So exposure, global exposure up, just to bring out the colors to begin with. The background will remain white. And then I would mask the subject, as I like to do. Sometimes you might see a little bit of a vignetting effect or something in the blue, especially if you were photographing against blue sky. So that's why, to play it safe, just mask the subject. I would add to the subject mask, I would add this piece of the branch to the subject, and then I would subtract from the mask just in between the tail feathers there. You can see there's a bit of a mask happening there and in there as well. So just make sure you've got clean borders when it comes to subject masking. And there you go. That's a well-defined subject. Right, so same thing. I would do whites. The whites are clipping, but it's not, I mean, the indicator's on and it's really minimal. If I go up, then you'll see where the clipping is, and that really doesn't bother me too much. So in this case, I would just look at the subject and see what the whites are doing. And the same with the blacks. Take it down just before the blacks start losing detail. That's where I would leave it. And then again, shadows up slightly on the subject. Remember, it will wash out when you do this. Keep watching the histogram and make changes to the other sliders if necessary. There's no bright highlights that I need to brush down on this image, so I wouldn't be doing that. I do sometimes add texture and clarity, but very, very few compared to the color to the black and white images, because they can be grungy and textury, but be careful of that in color images, because it can look a little bit pencily and black when you add that. Now I would add saturation. I'm still in the mask, so I can either add it here, but with vibrance and saturation, I prefer to use vibrance. So in this case, I would do vibrance. I'm now out of the mask and I'm doing it as a general vibrance. If there was anything in the background that was now being affected by your global vibrance adjustment, then you can go in and do a color range mask on each of the colors that you find need some more saturation. And now I'm looking at it and I'm thinking maybe dehaze would help. Sometimes if you dehaze, then you need to brighten it up again ever so slightly. I'm not too phased about these highlights blowing out there. And then we'll see maybe some contrast, but I'm pretty happy with that. And then at the end, I see what a slight add in exposure does to the image. And there's a beautiful high key in color compared to the first shot in camera.
All right, and that was high key. Let's talk about low key. Low key is the opposite. So dark images, full of shadows, characterized by drama and mood, and predominantly dark or deep tones. Light on the subject remains to identify it, while the surrounding detail is mostly lost. Not all of it, but mostly. And this is what I mean by low key. So you'll see there's light on the subject that identifies it as a lion and as a hippo, but there's also a lot of shadows and a lot of mood in the image. These two are rim light and backlight, forms of low key techniques. This is front light, a little bit flat. I'm not such a fan of front light, but there's front light, and then side light, and another side light to give a low key effect. The light conditions necessary would be light on parts or all of the subject. So it doesn't have to, the subject doesn't have to be lit up completely. It can literally, like you saw with the lion, just a rim around the lion's face is fine. The background has to be mostly dark or shadowed. So again, contrast is very important. Front light, rim light, and side light work really well for low key. Early morning and late afternoon, nice golden light works best. Rim light, something with fur or hair or fluff or feathers, works really good. If you're looking for, the rim on the fur or the hair that catches the light. And then side light, textured wildlife, for example, this crocodile worked really well for side light because of the texture on it. Rain, dust, bugs, and water droplets are absolutely fabulous, and I'll show you an example now with low-key conditions. This is to demonstrate that it's rim light, but you don't necessarily need an all-black background. These backlit leaves look really nice on a backlit image here, low-key. That's what I mean by water. Makes such a big difference to a low-key image if there's spray. That might as well have been dust or bugs, but the backlit water just works so well in a low-key image. Then a spotted hyena with some flies, as I say, bugs light up nicely, and the dust that he's kicking up works very well for a low key. Camera settings necessary. Mode, same as with high key, any mode in which you can apply exposure compensation. In this case, you're exposing for the light on the subject. So you're not worried about the dark background, you're not worried about the shadows on the subject. You just want that last little bit of light on the subject to remain. Note that the blacks merging with the background might pose a bit of a problem. So you'll see here eyelashes. Elephants actually have really long eyelashes. So its eyelashes probably come to about there. But unfortunately, it's lost in the background. That's very difficult to brush back. But legs, so some egrets, for example, have black legs, and you can, with a lot of time and patience, you can brush them back. underexposed. So taking away light here, I started -2, but I'm not as specific about it as I am with high key, because you're taking away light. So -2 or -3 is fine to start off with. Same thing, I'm in evaluative metering and I use my exposure compensation. If you're in spot metering or full manual, it's a different story. You have to spot meter right on the light part of the elephant here. And if you're in full manual, you need to take control of the exposure with your settings. Aperture large, but I'm really not too phased about specific settings here. Shutter speed is pretty normal. Often you have to actually up your shutter speed because you're trying to take away 3 stops of light sometimes, and you need to help the camera to block out enough light to get that effect. So sometimes you're actually upping your shutter speed to get to -3. ISO lower is always better, but I'm not nearly as phased about ISO and low key because you are underexposing, you're taking away light, and your ISO will probably end up low. Subject whites shouldn't clip. The risk is really low because, again, you're underexposing, but keep your highlight alerts on. Focus tracking, again, might struggle. Single or cluster focus points, same as with high key. When you're shooting in difficult lighting situations, then that's something to keep in mind. Focus on a contrast area, so where the light on the subject meets the black background. That's the best bit to focus on. This is taking away 3 stops of light in camera. This is what the camera thought was a good exposure because there's a seriously dark background behind this baboon. I took away 3 stops of light and that's the result. Here I took away 3 1/3 stops of light, a white egret with a dark background, and it took away all the shadows in the background. It would dumb them down and the egret remained well exposed. You're exposing for the white subject. Same with this hammerkop. Nice dark background behind the brightly lit bird. I saw this bright light and I thought, let's take away most of the light and just leave this slither of light on it to identify it. So I took away 3 2/3 stops of light. As for editing, light on the subject is your priority. So this golden light you want to have well exposed. Again, convert to black and white first if that's your goal. Don't do it last. Contrast remains the goal here. There's a theme here throughout the presentation. Contrast is key. And then masking for localized edits on the subject. I still do that as with high key. Be very careful of brushing on a black background. Global edit of the background is better. I have bumped my head with this where you brush and you can't see it on your screen, your strokes, but then someone puts it on a TV screen somewhere and all your brush strokes show up as ugly lines on a black background. So rather mask the background or do a global edit on the whole background. Take away the whole exposure on the background at once. And then vignetting works very well with with low key images. Vignette adds a little bit of extra mood. Global edits, same as with high key, starting with noise reduction and sharpening if necessary. Convert it to black and white, decrease global exposure, take away light. Remember, we're low, we take away, we make it darker until your background's dark. Often, white balance I do change. I make it a bit warmer because we are photographing in early morning and late afternoon light. So I'm enhancing the warm temperature of the light. And then local edits, I mask the subject. Again, not a recipe, but this is what works for me. Whites and blacks to clipping points, increase the local highlights. So often when you're taking away exposure, the highlights on the subject do unfortunately go a little bit dull and you have to bring them back. You have to paint them back. If there are important shadows that you want to bring back, then like eyes or legs, like I mentioned, then you brush them back afterwards. Texture and clarity works really well, especially with side lighting, and contrast added if necessary, if you haven't added enough contrast with all your other edits. All right, so again, this is a shorter video just to show one photograph of a Loki. If the volume's too low, just set up your volume here. It's a bit low on my side, but here goes.
This Chakma baboon makes for a beautiful low-key edit. As you can see, my ISO is low because I was already underexposed by 3 stops in camera, and I could keep my shutter speed fairly high because I'm not adding light, so my ISO is not running up, I'm taking away light. If I was to have been at 0 in camera, it would have looked something like this, just a normal image of a baboon. But because we are photographing artistically, we start off at -3. I don't mind the greenery in the background. I actually like it. It will go away because I'll be taking away more exposure, so most of it should go away, but I really don't mind it. If you do, then you can mask the background out and get rid of it. But I actually quite like some greenery in the background. I'm not going to apply any noise reduction because the ISO is low. So I would again start with sharpening with a mask and just sharpen the subject alone. I don't want to turn this into black and white, but if I did, then this is the time that I would do it. Then I would take away global exposure, the whole image. Watching the background, I know the subject is disappearing as well, but we can bring that back. So I'm happy with the background there. I'm thinking of how nicely these highlights are going to stand out against the dark background. So I'm darkening the background for contrast purposes. Because we are photographing early morning and late afternoon, generally for low key, I would add a little bit of temperature because I know the light temperature was warm. Next thing, I would mask the subject. Now, hairy subjects mask not so easily because of all the fur around. So I would brush a little bit of the mask away up here, but I don't edit in a dramatic form. So I tend to not end up with halos around the subject. If you do, then you need to change your editing so that you don't end up with dramatic changes visible around the subject. Now we're on the subject, I would do the whites, which will bring out the nice light bits on the baboon beautifully against the dark background, and it's not clipping watching the histogram. The blacks will clip probably. That's the amount that's clipping, and that's okay with me. I'm more concerned about the highlights. The highlights are what makes a low-key image stand out. So I'm not too phased about losing detail in the blacks. I'll go down even more. See how beautifully that stands out. Now I would enhance local highlights. So while I'm in the mask, I can bring up highlights. And sometimes if there's a break in the continuity of the highlights on the whole border, then I would paint them back with a brush. But in this case, you can still identify that this is a baboon just by those highlights. Every now and again, I might go out of the mask again and decrease the exposure even more. So it's a bit of back and forth between the sliders until you get your wanted effect. If there were any shadows that I wanted painted back in the subject, then I would do that with a brush. But in this case, as I say, the highlights speak what they have to speak here. They tell you that it's a baboon, and that's all that's necessary. I would add some, again in the mask, I would add some texture and clarity onto the baboon, and then maybe some contrast, but contrast, again, I would probably do afterwards. Let's see. There's really no recipe here. I'm just looking at the image and deciding where to do contrast and where not to do contrast. And then add a vignette. If you like a really dramatic low-key, then a vignette helps that end product. I like context, as I said here. I like seeing that the baboon's sitting on a mound. So I'm pretty happy with that, just to show you a before and an after from a normal baboon photograph to a quick low-key edit of the baboon for a dramatic artistic effect.
All right, so that is about it for the editing. The takeaway from this, I would say, is learn to take control of your exposure in camera. Really important, learn to play with light in camera and learn to use your exposure compensation. That's really important. Those two go hand in hand. And then lastly, get excited when you see contrast, because contrast equals creativity. And that's something that all photographers should get excited about.
Baboon makes for.
There we go. And that's about it from my side.
Wow, Danielle, that was absolutely incredible. I feel so inspired and would just love to go out in nature right now with my camera and just put these great new skills to use. So everybody, we have some great time for Q&A right now. So in your control panel, click that question section and submit what you have. We have about 10 more minutes now with Danielle. So lots of time to ask an expert what she does and how she does it. So go ahead and submit those in because so far we have a relatively quiet Q&A here. So how about to begin, Danielle? So let's say that we're all feeling super inspired and we want to start practicing these techniques now, but we don't necessarily have the shots that you just gave us because we haven't been back out in the field yet. What do you recommend we do? Are there any particular photos in our backlog that we should see if we have to practice these techniques, or should we just start from scratch and go out and try to find them?
No, absolutely. It's actually the weirdest thing about high key and low key is the photographs that you usually throw out are actually, most of them hold pretty good potential to edit into a high key and a low key because you photograph them at a normal exposure. You don't photograph them at a minus exposure, and they come out. I showed you what it would be like if straight out of camera, and it's just a bland, normal photograph. But go through your library and have a look at contrast the images or potentially contrast the images and just play around just with your global exposure slider, and you'll be surprised at what comes out, especially photographs that you took against the sky of birds, for example. It won't be perfect because obviously your settings weren't intentional, but I promise you that you'll get it if you haven't thrown them away or binned them. You'll get a few beautiful images to convert into high key and low key if the conditions were right, definitely.
That is very helpful. So there you go, everybody. We have some hope for our throwaway photos. So
Yes.
that we all have homework this weekend. So thanks for that, Danielle. Okay, next. Do you prefer black and white photography? Is that one of your favorite editing techniques that you do?
I do. I often have guests asking me, do I only do black and white conversions when I edit? But it's not true. Most of them, no, I'm kidding. I like black and white just because I lean towards minimalism, and black and white is a minimalistic look and feel to the photograph. So I enjoy black and white because it's a way of simplifying a photograph. And simplification is one of the most important aspects of or characteristics of a good photograph. So that's why I really enjoy black and white photography.
I love it too. Yeah, the photos you shared with us were just absolutely stunning. That cheetah photo, with the family, that
Yeah.
was great. Really spoke to me a lot. Okay, let's see what else we have in here. Um, okay, what type of camera do you use? And does that also, and then extending on past that, what do you think about mirrorless versus DSLR for camera types?
I use a mirrorless now because it's my job to keep up with the latest trends. There's nothing wrong with DSLR cameras at all. I had one for years and years, and it was amazing, and I still miss it. But as if you do you know what one big advantage of mirrorless is, especially about this topic that we're talking about, is that you can see your exposure live in your viewfinder, which you can't do with a DSLR. So you know how much to over or underexpose already before you even press your shutter button. And that's a big advantage of mirrorless. So if you are into creative photography like this, then mirrorless will definitely help you. Having said that, I did the same thing for years. I took the same type of photographs with the DSLR, but the mirrorless cameras do make it much easier in that sense, together with a few other advantages.
Fantastic. Okay, we're getting a couple cases here to throw out to you and see how you would handle them. So it sounds like I'm assuming this guest might be photographing penguins soon. How would you tackle if you're photographing a penguin against snow to get this beautiful high key look?
That's tricky. It depends which penguin. But if it has a lot of white in it, it's going to be a challenge. You know what I was talking about, the pygmy goose that I showed that I had on my high key slide. So the whites merging into the background. That's probably what's going to happen with a penguin in snow. same issue that we have with fish eagles in Africa. It has this white bits on it that just merges into the bright sky behind it. So it's tricky. So I would probably use side lighting to differentiate the whites by texture from the background when I photograph penguins. That's one idea to do it. Otherwise, just be very sure that you don't overexpose the whites on the penguin. So rather expose for the blacks on the penguin or the darker tones and then edit it back later, but just be very careful of the white. Same concepts of this, whether it's giraffes against the sky or penguins against the snow. It's exactly the same concepts. The photographic concepts remain the same. But yeah, try some side lighting. I hope you have a wide angle lens because I've always dreamed of photographing penguins with a wide angle to show the vastness of the environment. But that's my one of my quick tips I'd have for penguins in the snow.
Yeah, that's a great tip. It seems like we all need to have this webinar on replay and watch it a couple times before we go back into these potentially high contrast situations. So next use case scenario, what about landscape photography? Is it possible to use this high key and or low key concept when we are going out for landscape photography?
Yes, it is. With landscape, you have a little bit more time, so you have time to play, and you can do, I mean, a lot of HDR landscape because you're working with the sky, so a lot of HDR, high dynamic range photography, but also use of filters to try and work with that contrast, because you sit with the same issue. The sky is going to be completely blown out and the foreground is going to be well exposed, or vice versa. So it depends what effect you want to go for. But for example, a tree against the sky would work really well as a high key. So blow out the sky completely and have this tree showing up against a white background. That could work really well if that's your type of photograph. But if you want to keep, detail in both, then you'll have to use filters and all of that. But I've done some amazing landscape high key photography in Kenya, where it's open plains and then this tree, lone tree against the sky, and there happen to be giraffes under it too. But that I took it as a silhouette. But there's a lot of options with landscape photography, as long as you apply the same concepts, expose for your subject, and you'll get a high or a low key effect.
That is a fantastic tip there. I'm as you were saying that, I was thinking about a lot of locations in like Western US with some dramatic, rock cliffs or something like that
Yeah,
against the sky. That could
yeah,
potentially work really well with this high key concept.
yeah, definitely.
All right. All right, next. So this is a great question. So somebody's considering traveling to South Africa, and you obviously lead trips there. So what are some of the good locations that you have found to do wildlife photography in particular in South Africa?
For NatHab, I lead trips to Madikwe, Marataba, and Mala Mala. Those are the three destinations. You can have a look at the secluded South Africa itinerary on the NatHab website. And the last destination is Mala Mala, and that's in the Greater Kruger. It's next to Kruger National Park, so it's in the Greater Kruger area. And I find that suits my photographic style really well. I love it there. I love the opportunities. I love you have a lot of different types of vegetation and topography to work with. So there's a lot of variation in the types of photograph that you get, and it's wildlife abundant. So the Greater Kruger area is definitely my favorite in South Africa. And then there's the Kalahari regions, which are the drier, semi-arid regions in South Africa, more to the north and the west of South Africa. We also get very minimalistic open grassland areas or open sandy dunes, and that sort of photography also appeals to me. So I'd say those two areas are my favorite, the Kalahari and the Greater Kruger.
Yeah, those sound beautiful. Everybody, yes, go on one of our great photo expeditions and to be with our great photo guides here like Danielle and learn so much. I mean, just being with you in the field would just be like the greatest hands-on experience to really work these brand new skills that we all have. So,
And you don't
all
have to be
right.
advanced. I must just say, Brooke, I must just say
Yeah,
that we have beginners on our photo trips and we have more advanced photographers, but it's the same concept for everyone, and it's just learning the concept. So it's really not for professional photographers, these trips. It's often a misperception that guests have that you have to be a good photographer to come on these trips, but you don't. You can just be a passionate photographer.
I absolutely agree. I went on one of our Galapagos photo trips a few years ago, and exact same thing. I was not a professional going in, but man, I was getting some beautiful photos by the end. It definitely
Yeah,
transformed my own photography being on one of our photo trips. So I completely agree with that. It was awesome.
great.
Okay, here. Well, I think that that is the last question that I will ask you today, Danielle. So I will turn it back to you for any last closing comments.
Oh, thanks so much, everyone, for joining. I really appreciate it, especially those in my neck of the woods in Africa. It's pretty late here at night, so I really appreciate those of you who tuned in from this time zone, and then of course everyone in the States as well, and wherever you are across the continent. Thanks so much, and thanks, Brooke, for your time and your hosting.
You bet, Danielle. Thank you so much for coming on. And everybody, I already have Danielle scheduled in Q1 next year. So please keep an eye out on your e-news announcements because I'm sure we're going to get part two of this, if that's right, Danielle. I imagine we all want a part two. So
Yeah,
thanks
awesome.
again, Danielle, for taking the time to present. And thank you, everyone who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.